The letter arrived 3 days after they found my father's body hanging from the basement rafters, his face purple and swollen like a rotted plum. I hadn't spoken to him in 15 years. The last words between us were screamed accusations about things better left buried, but death has a way of making you forget why you stopped loving someone. The funeral was small, just me, the pastor, and Mrs. Henderson from next door, who kept dabbing her eyes with a tissue that had seen better days. The house looked smaller than I remembered. The white paint had yellowed and peeled away in long strips, revealing the gray wood beneath, like exposed bone. Weeds choked the garden where my mother once grew roses, and the front porch sagged under the weight of neglect. But it was mine now, along with everything inside. I found the security system on my second day of sorting through his belongings. It was new, expensive looking, with cameras positioned at every entrance and several rooms inside. Strange, considering my father had always been paranoid about technology, claiming the government was watching through every screen. The main unit sat in his bedroom closet, hidden behind a wall of moth-eaten coats. A small monitor displayed a grid of camera feeds, all showing empty rooms bathed in the pale green glow of night vision. But what caught my attention was the massive external hard drive connected to the system, nearly full, according to the display. Months of footage, maybe years. Curiosity killed the cat, but satisfaction brought it back. At least that's what I told myself as I carried the hard drive to my laptop. The earliest footage dated back 2 years. I fast-forwarded through hours of mundane recordings, my father shuffling between rooms, eating alone at the kitchen table, staring at the television with hollow eyes. The man I watched was a ghost of the father I remembered, thin and frail, moving through the house like he was afraid to disturb the silence. But then I found the first anomaly. It was 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in October. The kitchen camera showed my father standing at the sink, his back to the lens. Nothing unusual there. He'd always been an insomniac. But then he turned around and I saw his face. His eyes were completely white, rolled back so far that only the sclera showed. His mouth hung open in a perfect circle, and a thin stream of black liquid dripped from his lips onto his yellowed undershirt. He stood there for 47 minutes. I checked the timestamp 3 times, convinced there was an error. But the kitchen clock in the background confirmed it. He remained motionless for nearly an hour, eyes rolled back, that dark substance flowing from his mouth like oil from a cracked engine. The black liquid pooled at his feet, forming strange patterns on the linoleum, patterns that looked almost deliberate, like symbols carved into stone. During those 47 minutes, the temperature reading in the corner of the screen dropped from 72 degrees to 51 degrees. The refrigerator began cycling on and off rapidly, its compressor struggling against the sudden cold. Even more disturbing, shadows began moving in the periphery of the camera's view, long stretching shadows that had no corresponding objects to cast them. Then, as suddenly as it began, he blinked. His eyes rolled forward and he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, looking down at the black stain on his shirt with mild confusion. But when he looked at the floor, his face went pale. The black liquid had vanished, leaving only the faintest outline of those strange symbols etched into the linoleum. Symbols that looked like they'd been burned there. He shuffled back to his bedroom as if nothing had happened, but I noticed he avoided stepping on the spots where the liquid had pooled. My hands trembled as I reached for the bottle of whiskey I'd found in his cabinet. The first sip burned, but the second went down easier. I rewound the footage and watched it again, taking notes this time. The symbols, the temperature drop, the way his breathing had stopped completely during those 47 minutes, his chest never rising or falling. Whatever had happened to my father in that kitchen, he hadn't been alive when it occurred. Over the next week, I cataloged 12 more incidents. They followed a pattern, always between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m., lasting between 30 and 60 minutes. But each episode was different, progressively more disturbing than the last. In the living room footage from November 3rd, my father stood perfectly still in front of the old family portrait, the last one we'd taken before Sarah got sick. As he stood there with those horrible white eyes, the picture began to change. I watched, my blood turning to ice water, as Sarah's face in the photograph grew pale and translucent, matching her appearance in the bedroom footage I'd yet to discover. By the end of the 42-minute episode, her image had faded almost completely, leaving only a ghostly outline where my 8-year-old sister should have been. The hallway camera captured something even more disturbing on November 12th. My father stood at the top of the stairs, facing the camera, but his reflection in the mirror behind him showed someone else entirely. A tall, dark figure with impossibly long arms and fingers that seemed to stretch beyond the mirror's frame. The figure moved independently of my father, reaching out of the reflection as if trying to claw its way into the physical world. For 38 minutes they stood there, my father, motionless, and the shadow figure writhing behind the glass. But the footage from the dining room made me understand that whatever was happening to my father wasn't random. On November 18th, he sat at the table where we'd eaten family dinners decades ago. His hands were folded in front of him, and that black liquid poured from his mouth in steady streams. But this time the liquid didn't pool randomly. It flowed across the table in deliberate lines, forming letters, forming words. "I'm sorry, I'm sorry." The words appeared and disappeared as the liquid continued to flow, different messages emerging from the dark substance. "She was so small I couldn't stop. They're still here, they won't let me rest." Once, horrifyingly, he stood at the foot of the basement stairs, staring down into the darkness with those blank white eyes. But reviewing that footage more carefully, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The basement door, which I'd assumed was closed, was actually standing wide open. And in that darkness beyond, shapes moved. Small shapes, child-sized shapes that danced just beyond the camera's ability to capture clearly. But the worst was when he stood in my old bedroom. I'd avoided going in there since arriving. The door had remained closed, and I'd convinced myself it was out of respect for my childhood memories. But watching him on the monitor, standing perfectly still beside my old twin bed with black liquid streaming down his chin, I realized the real reason I'd stayed away. The room felt wrong. Even through the grainy security footage, I could sense it, a heaviness that pressed against the screen like fog against glass. The shadows seemed deeper in that room, the corners too dark for the camera's night vision to penetrate fully. Then there was something else, something that made my stomach churn with a familiar dread. He wasn't alone in there. The footage was too dark and the resolution too poor to make out details, but I could see movement in the periphery, shadows that shifted when they should have been still, shapes that didn't quite match the furniture I remembered. And once, Just once I saw what looked like a small hand pressed against the window from the inside, but that was impossible. The window was on the second floor. What disturbed me most about these bedroom episodes was my father's behavior. Unlike the other incidents where he stood rigid and motionless, in Sarah's room, he would move. Slowly, deliberately, he would walk to the toy chest in the corner. A chest I remembered being locked after she died. His hands would reach for the lid, and though the camera angle prevented me from seeing inside, I could see his face change. The blank white eyes would fill with tears, and his mouth would move as if he were speaking to someone. During one particularly long episode, lasting nearly an hour and 15 minutes, he opened the toy chest and began removing items. A yellow stuffed rabbit that had been Sarah's favorite, a porcelain doll with cracked features, a music box that played Für Elise, the same melody my mother used to hum while cooking dinner. But as he placed each item on the bed, they began to decay before my eyes. The rabbit's fur turned gray and matted. The doll's painted smile cracked and bled a substance that looked suspiciously like the black liquid pouring from my father's mouth. The music box played its melody, but the notes were wrong, distorted and stretched, like a record playing at the wrong speed. By the time the episode ended, the toys had crumbled to dust on the bed, and my father had collapsed to his knees, his mouth opening in what looked like a scream, though no sound came through the speakers. I started drinking more. It helped dull the edge of what I was seeing, made the impossible seem merely improbable. But the footage kept revealing new horrors, each one more disturbing than the last. In December, my father began talking during his episodes. The audio was poor, but I could make out fragments of one-sided conversations. He spoke to someone or something that wasn't visible on camera. His voice was different during these moments, younger, higher-pitched, almost childlike. "I'm sorry," he would whisper to the empty air. "I didn't mean to. Please don't be angry." And then, in a voice so small it barely registered on the microphone, "I know you're still down there. I know you're waiting." The conversations became more detailed as December progressed. On the 15th, during a kitchen episode, I heard him pleading, "Sarah, honey, Daddy didn't mean to hurt you. You were just so little, and I was so angry all the time. Your mother was going to take you away from me." The temperature readings during these talking episodes were even more extreme, dropping as low as 38 degrees. But more disturbing was what happened to the other appliances. The microwave would turn on by itself, its turntable spinning empty while the digital display flickered through random numbers. The coffee maker would brew phantom pots, hot water pouring into empty carafes that somehow overflowed anyway. Most unnervingly, during one December 22nd episode, I heard a second voice responding to my father's pleas. A child's voice, thin and reedy, speaking words that made my blood freeze. "You're sorry now, Daddy. But you weren't sorry when you put your hands around my throat. You weren't sorry when you made Mommy drink the poison. You weren't sorry when you buried us in that room." The basement camera had been damaged, its lens cracked and useless. But in the footage from the kitchen I could see the basement door. And more often than not, during my father's episodes, that door would be open. Just a crack, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. But darkness that seemed to breathe. I became obsessed with that damaged basement camera. Using a screwdriver I found in my father's toolbox, I pried the housing open to examine the lens. What I found inside made me stumble backward, nearly falling down the basement stairs. The lens hadn't been damaged by accident. It had been deliberately destroyed from the inside. Long scratches gouged through the glass, scratches that could only have been made by small fingernails clawing desperately at the surface. Fingernails that had left tiny flecks of what looked like dried blood embedded in the cracks. I called the police to ask about my father's death. The officer who'd found him was reluctant to talk, but after some pressing, he admitted there had been some unusual aspects to the scene. The rope my father had used was too short. He would have had to remain in a crouch position for the hanging to be effective. And there were marks on his ankles, like something had been pulling him down. Probably just the body settling, the officer had said, but his voice carried no conviction. When I pressed him further, he admitted something else. They'd found children's toys scattered around the basement. Old toys, covered in dust and what the coroner had identified as human saliva. But there were no children living in the house, and my father had never mentioned grandchildren. We figured he was just a lonely old man, the officer explained. Sometimes they keep mementos from when their kids were young. Nothing criminal about it. But I knew better. Those weren't mementos. They were offerings. 3 weeks into my investigation of the footage, I found something that made me drop my laptop, the screen cracking against the hardwood floor. It was a file buried deep in the system's directory, labeled simply Sarah Bedroom, July 15, 1987. My breath caught in my throat. Sarah was my younger sister. She died when I was 12 and she was 8. Cancer, my parents had told me. But July 15th, 1987. That was 3 months before she'd supposedly gotten sick. With shaking fingers, I opened the file. The footage was old, degraded, filmed on equipment that predated the digital system by decades. The timestamp showed it had been converted from an even older format, probably 8mm film. But there she was, Sarah, 8 years old, standing in our shared bedroom in her favorite yellow pajamas. The same bedroom where my father had been having his episodes. But something was wrong with the footage. Sarah moved too slowly, like she was underwater. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and when she turned toward the camera, I saw that her eyes were the same milky white as my father's during his episodes. The timestamp read 3:33 a.m. As I watched, paralyzed with horror, Sarah walked to the window and pressed her small hand against the glass. The same hand I'd glimpsed in the recent footage. But unlike the recent recordings, this old footage had audio. Sarah's voice came through clearly, though it sounded wrong, too deep for a child, echoing as if spoken from the bottom of a well. "Tommy," she said, looking directly into the camera. "Tommy, why didn't you help me? You knew what Daddy was doing. You heard me crying every night." The camera angle shifted slightly, and I could see my old bed in the background. I was there, 12-year-old me apparently asleep under the covers. But as Sarah continued speaking, my past self sat up in bed, his eyes, my eyes, glowing with the same white light. "He promised me candy if I came down to the basement," Sarah continued, her child's voice carrying an adult's understanding of betrayal. "He said it was our special secret. But it hurt, Tommy. It hurt so much. And you never came to help me." The footage showed my younger self climbing out of bed and walking towards Sarah. When I reached her, past me, placed a hand over her mouth, silencing her accusations. The look in my 12-year-old eyes was cold, calculating. Not the expression of a child, but of someone much older, much more aware of consequences. "If you tell, My past self whispered. They'll take me away too. And then who will protect you from him? The footage cut to black, but I could hear Sarah's muffled sobs through the speakers. I sat staring at the cracked laptop screen, my hands shaking so violently I could barely hold the device. The memory came flooding back, not the sanitized version I'd carried for 38 years, but the truth. I had known. I had seen Sarah returning from the basement with tear-stained cheeks and grass stains on her yellow pajamas from being dragged across the basement floor. I had heard her whimper my name in the darkness, begging me to make it stop. And I had chosen silence. Not out of ignorance, but out of cowardice, because keeping quiet meant I stayed safe. It meant I didn't become my father's next victim. There were more files, dozens of them stretching back years. My father had been documenting everything, creating a record of his crimes and my complicity. Helen's Kitchen, August 1987, showed my mother confronting him about Sarah, her voice shrill with panic and rage. Helen, basement. September 1987 showed what happened when she threatened to call the police. The footage was difficult to watch. My mother, once vibrant and strong, reduced to a broken woman begging for her life as my father forced poison down her throat. But the most horrific part was the audio, my own voice in the background, 12 years old and cold as winter, saying, "Make sure she drinks it all, Daddy. We can't have her telling anyone our family secrets." I found the key to the basement in my father's nightstand, wrapped in a child's yellow sock. My hands shook so violently I could barely fit it into the lock. The stairs creaked under my weight, each step echoing in the darkness below. The smell hit me halfway down, sweet and cloying like flowers left too long in stagnant water. But underneath that floral scent was something else, something that made my stomach lurch and my vision blur. The basement was exactly as I remembered from childhood, except for one crucial difference. Where there had once been a concrete wall, there was now a door. A small door, barely 4 feet high, painted the same yellow as Sarah's pajamas. The door was slightly ajar. My phone's flashlight trembled in my grip as I approached. Through the gap I could see a small room, a child's room, with a twin bed covered in a yellow blanket and stuffed animals arranged along the walls. But the stuffed animals were wrong, their fur matted and dark with something that had dried long ago. And there, on the bed, was a shape under the covers. I knew I should run. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, climb those stairs, and never look back. But I was past the point of rational thought. The truth had become a living thing inside me, demanding to be fed. I pushed open the door. The smell was overwhelming now. Decay mixed with something medicinal, like the cancer ward where my mother had supposedly died. But as I stepped into the room, I realized the shape on the bed wasn't Sarah. It was my mother. She lay on her side, facing the wall, wearing the same hospital gown she died in, or supposedly died in. Her back was to me, but I could see her shoulders moving slightly with each breath. She was alive, or something that had once been alive. "Mom?" The word came out as barely a whisper. She turned toward me, and I saw what 38 years in that basement had done to her. Her skin was translucent, stretched tight over bones that seemed to glow with their own sickly light. Her eyes were gone, just empty sockets that wept tears of the same black substance I'd seen in the footage. But she smiled when she saw me. A wide, loving smile with too many teeth. "Tommy," she said, her voice like wind through dead leaves. "You came back." We've been waiting for you." That's when I heard the footsteps on the stairs behind me. I turned to see my father descending into the basement, but not the frail old man from the security footage. This was my father as he'd been in life, strong, imposing, his face twisted with the same rage I remembered from childhood. Behind him came Sarah, still 8 years old, still wearing those yellow pajamas. But her skin had the same translucent quality as our mother's. "Did you really think you could run away from us, Tommy?" my father asked, his voice carrying that old familiar menace. "Did you think distance and time would make what happened here disappear?" The pieces were falling into place now, each revelation more horrifying than the last. The security system hadn't been installed to keep intruders out. It had been installed to keep them in. My father hadn't been having episodes. He'd been having visits. And the basement door that was always slightly open during those visits wasn't letting something out. It was letting them back in. "You left us here," Sarah whispered, her voice carrying across 38 years of resentment. "You left us with him. You knew what he was doing and you ran away." But I hadn't known. Not really. I'd suspected, the way children suspect when something is wrong, but lack the words or courage to name it. I'd heard Sarah crying at night, seen the bruises she'd claimed came from falling down. I'd watched our mother grow thin and sick, retreating into herself until she simply wasn't there anymore. And I'd said nothing. "The cancer was a lie," my mother said, struggling to sit up in the narrow bed. "He poisoned me slowly over months because I finally threatened to tell someone about Sarah. Made it look like I was sick. Made it look natural." My father laughed, the sound echoing off the basement walls like breaking glass. "You were always too smart for your own good, Helen. But Tommy here, Tommy was the smart one. He knew when to keep his mouth shut, when to look the other way." That's when I understood the final, most horrible truth. I hadn't just been a witness to my family's destruction. I'd been an accomplice. My silence had enabled it. My cowardice had allowed it to continue. And now they wanted payment for my betrayal. "The hanging was just theater," my father continued, moving closer. "Had to make it look convincing for the police. But death is just another room in this house, Tommy. And family stays together." I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. It was as if the basement itself was holding me in place, the air thick as molasses. Behind me, I could hear my mother climbing out of the bed, her joints creaking like old hinges. "We've been practicing," Sarah said, her child's voice eerily conversational. "Learning how to move between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Daddy figured it out first. That's how he was able to visit me all those nights after you left. Then, Mama joined us. And now it's your turn." The security footage made sense now. My father hadn't been having episodes. He'd been learning to die temporarily, to cross over and visit his victims, to feed on their terror and pain. The black liquid wasn't some supernatural substance. It was the physical manifestation of his guilt, his sins literally pouring out of him. But guilt, I was learning, wasn't enough for absolution. "Please," I whispered, though I wasn't sure what I was begging for. Forgiveness, a quick death, a chance to undo 38 years of willful blindness. My father reached into his pocket and pulled out a length of rope. The same rope that had been around his neck when they'd found him. The rope that had been too short, that had required something to pull him down to make the hanging work. "Don't worry, son," he said, his voice almost gentle now. "It'll only hurt for a moment." and then we'll be together. Forever. As the rope went around my neck, I thought about the security cameras upstairs, still recording, still watching. Whoever found my body would see the footage eventually. They'd see me walking into the basement alive and never coming back out. But they'd never find this room. They'd never know the truth about what happened to my family. And someday, when the house changed hands again, someone else would inherit those security recordings. Someone else would become curious about the anomalies in the footage. Someone else would find the key wrapped in a yellow sock. The rope tightened, and my father's dead hands pulled me down into the darkness where my family was waiting, where they'd always been waiting. The last thing I saw before the black spots consumed my vision was the security camera mounted in the corner of the hidden room, its red recording light blinking steadily in the dark. Still watching, still recording, still waiting for the next curious soul to press play.